everybody. This is Ryan Wiggins and for Reed Galen. I am the communications director for the Lincoln Project. And today we have an incredible guest, David Laufman. He is on Twitter at David Laufman Law. He is a partner at Wiggins and Dana, who chairs the firm's national security practice and has represented the U.S. Capitol Police officers Gunnell and Dunn regarding their witness testimony before the 1-6 Commission. So we're very happy to have you here, David. Welcome.
Thank you. Happy to be with you.
So we want to talk to you about a lot of things today, but let's start talking about the rally this weekend that wasn't. I know that, that was something that we were watching very closely at the Lincoln Project. We were concerned about, I think, and so was everyone at the Capitol, about a repeat of 1-6. What did you think about that this weekend? What did you think about, what we saw actually unfold there?
Well, I was most grateful that the law enforcement officers were not put at risk as they were on January 6th, and that they all came home safely. There could be a lot of reasons why the numbers were as low as they were. We'll have to wait and see what more we learn. To some extent, I suppose it perhaps even further delegitimized the types of folks that showed up on January 6th. I mean, this rally was really to extol the virtues of people who have been criminally charged, and held to account by the Department of Justice, many of whom have pled guilty, some of whom are detained, many of whom aren't detained. Those were the people who were the heroes of the group that assembled this weekend, people who have been charged with committing crimes associated with an attempted insurrection and undermining of the U.S. democratic system on January 6th. That's
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you think this could serve as a golden opportunity for people to kind of say, you know what, this is no longer a threat to our national security? We clearly are seeing that, maybe Trump is losing some support. I know that last week, or maybe the week before, he had a rally. He was expecting 10,000. I think 300 showed up. I think the rally this weekend, some reports say there was maximum of 400. Other reports are saying it's closer to 100. Do you think that this is a chance for America to take a deep breath and say, okay, maybe this isn't as bad as we thought it was?
I certainly hope not. I think law enforcement is collectively, in a much more coordinated fashion, sharing information around the country at the federal, state, and local level, monitoring so-called chatter, looking at what's happening online, and trying to stay more on top of potential plotting of political violence around the country as a result of what happened on January 6th. I mean, we could see a type of January 6th attack mounted anywhere across the United States, at state capitals, at federal, state, or local government buildings. And we can't afford for a moment as a country to take our eye off that ball and off of this threat. You've heard the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, who was a colleague of mine when I was at the Department of Justice as chief of staff to the Deputy Attorney General in the first George W. Bush administration. You've heard Director Wray talk about domestic extremism on the right as the number one threat to the national security of the United States, and that is exactly right.
Do you think it's likely that we will see these kinds of things happening more at a local level as we get closer to 2022 and 2024?
I think it's possible. I mean, these folks would be looking for softer targets. Washington, D.C. obviously is a heavily policed area where forces can be massed. You saw what happened, I think it was in the Michigan state legislature many, many months ago, where insurrectionists stormed the Capitol building and occupied the legislative chamber. That was just shocking. Some of them were armed. I can't think of anything that is more stunningly presenting a peril to democracy than that type of threat. And there's no reason to think it can't be replicated across this country. So it's going to put a premium on anticipation, intelligence gathering, and are all applicable laws and authorities at the federal, state, and local level to stay on top of this threat, to detect and disrupt any additional threats to homeland security.
Yes, I totally agree with you. I was talking to my husband a little bit before this weekend's rally about what could and could not happen. We watched 1/6 live as it was happening and really shook both of us. And I told him, I said, one of the reasons 1/6 I think was so successful to the degree it was for the insurrectionists was because it was not expected. We knew they were having a rally. We were not expecting what came out of that rally. I think that people are now expecting it a little bit more in DC, and that does scare me because terrorists don't typically announce their terrorist acts before they engage in them. What do you think about that? Do you think that we're more likely to see attacks that are not as pronounced as maybe 1/6 was?
Well, I think we need to anticipate that there will be plotting of other attacks around the country, elsewhere outside of Washington, D.C. I mean, this movement is national in scope. It focused on the Capitol on January 6th because that's where the certification of ballots was about to take place. But there's every reason to expect that this threat is manifesting itself at the state and local level across the United States. And that means that the FBI is going to have to work closely with the Department of Homeland Security and state and local law enforcement to monitor, identify potential plots, and disrupt them before they present actual live threats.
So going into this weekend, we talked about this a little bit before we came on air. Last week, there were a lot of groups on the alt-right that were telling people, don't come, it's a trap, it's a trap. I think even former President Trump stood up and said, this is, I support the insurrectionists. I support this group of people, but yeah, you definitely should not come. It's a trap. Because of that, I think you saw a lot of Republican lawmakers who had at one point in time stood and maybe had been, a part potentially of the insurrection on 1/6, or certainly be investigated for it, that decided to steer clear of the Capitol this weekend. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends how low the bar is. So Republican members decided not to be physically present for a rally celebrating individuals who've been criminally charged with conduct associated with an armed attack on the U.S. Capitol. Well, good for them. I mean, I suppose we should celebrate that act of putting, country over cowardly self-interest. It's hard to know. These people are nuts. It's hard to know what their risk calculus is. This rally was a little different in that, as I say, the purpose of this was to come to the defense of people who've been criminally charged associated with the January 6th attacks. And maybe that was a line too far for some of these characters. But to the extent they stayed away, I'm glad they did.
I agree with you. We have a audience question. There's a Trump rally planned in Georgia this upcoming Saturday. What do you think they could see there? Could it be dangerous?
Well, I suppose it could be, but only the law enforcement agencies that are trying to determine what the intent is behind this rally, who's coming, what is being said about it in online chat rooms or other online media that may be clues as to whether there is any intent to transform what otherwise would be a peaceful constitutional expression of First Amendment freedoms into potential acts of political violence. That's why we have law enforcement agencies, to keep us safe from situations where peaceful expressions of First Amendment freedoms could cross the line into acts of political violence.
David, you have served under a bunch of different administrations at this point. Before going out and kind of on your own, why do you think Republicans are failing to acknowledge the threat of domestic terrorism on our own soil?
I think by and large, it is cowardly self-interest, either fearful that denouncing what many of them, I think, believe is a gross violation of constitutional and national norms, would put their political careers in jeopardy, possibly even create personal safety issues for them, has meant that they are putting their self-interest above the national interest. It's just the most shocking, disappointing thing of all, for there not to be a complete universal revulsion on the part of all Republicans about what happened on January 6th is sickening. It's despicable. And it is one of the major reasons why the country remains at risk in the mid-year elections and in 2024 to a return to power of would-be dictatorship, which is what we barely averted at the end of the last administration.
We have another audience question, and this is one I'm actually very interested in too. We've talked about it several times on several of our shows, about how, it's not often that maybe it's really never happened outside of Richard Nixon, who stepped down before it could have happened. Do you think there is a chance that Trump will ever be held accountable for inciting an erection on January 6th? I mean, what more does the DOJ need? We saw what we saw. We all watched it go down on 1/6. What do you think the holdup is? And do you think that there's a possibility that he will ever be taken to task for this?
Well, there was a little thing called an impeachment proceeding that happened several months ago, which was one mechanism that seemed like an obvious way to hold him accountable. That failed for political reasons. I mean, there's been some reporting that the Attorney General and the new leadership of the Department of Justice, as a kind of corporate policy, have decided not to pursue a criminal investigation, let alone criminal charges against the former president, lest the administration be seen as seeking retribution for the prior regime, a scenario that we see played out in countries around the world where a new regime takes power and seeks retribution on the old regime. We don't want to become that type of country. That's not a path we want to go down. At the same time, if the former president did in fact violate criminal laws, and under Department of Justice policy, they have sufficient admissible evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed those crimes, it would trouble me if they did not pursue those investigations to the fullest to make the most informed judgment possible about whether criminal prosecution is appropriate, taking into account all the variables, including the ones I mentioned. I don't have the sense that is happening, and I find that troubling. I understand what considerations might be animating it. There are difficult lines to draw between constitutionally protected speech and speech that morphs into potential sedition or conspiracy to commit sedition. Those are really tough judgment calls to make, but they need to be made. I would be okay knowing that they underwent a complete, exhaustive investigation and just came to a judgment in their discretion, in their prudential judgment, that prosecution was not appropriate. But I would like at least for them to go through that process and exhaust that judgment.
The investigation is ongoing in Georgia. Do you think that there is a better chance that maybe Georgia could find a reason to come after the Trump organization than the Department of Justice could, considering the fact that Georgia is a mostly Republican-run state?
Well, the facts don't seem particularly in dispute there. The audio recordings of these calls, there could be differing views about what the president's intent was in making those calls, notwithstanding the plain language of the recordings, and those raise questions that need to be addressed. It would be enough for me to know that Georgia law enforcement authorities conducted a full and complete investigation and appropriately exercised their prosecutorial discretion in assessing whether crimes were committed and whether they should be charged in that case. And we'll just have to wait and see whether they get that far.
Going back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier about you representing two officers in the 1/6 Commission, I kind of want to talk to you a little bit about what 1/6 looked like for you as someone who has served in DOJ and has served, our country for years. What was that like? What was it like for you watching that unfold? Were you watching it live, or how did you find out that it was happening? And walk me through that day.
It was one of the worst days of my life as an American, maybe the worst day. And I was chief of staff to the Deputy Attorney General on 9/11, and helped deal with the Justice Department's response that day in the days and weeks and months afterwards. Perhaps I would feel differently about it if I lost a loved one or a close friend in the attacks in New York and the Pentagon, in the Flight 93 disaster. But to me, what happened on January 6th was the most despairing, sickening thing I've ever felt. To see the Capitol building stormed by our fellow citizens, attacking law enforcement officers, penetrating the chambers of the Senate and House, wreaking havoc, defiling the citadel of democracy. It was the most shocking thing I have ever witnessed. And from a personal standpoint too, I worked at the Capitol building in the late '90s for 4 years when I was on the House Ethics Committee staff. The building is just a cathedral to democracy, beautiful inside and out, and to contemplate these Visigoths, these barbarians desecrating it was just a horrible thing to behold, and to think how close we actually came to the type of havoc they were trying to accomplish. When we came within a hair of disaster. What if they had killed members of Congress? What if they had come into physical possession of the box containing the ballots that needed certification? The election finalization could have been thrown into complete havoc. It was just a debacle of a day for our country, and a stain that will take a long time to resolve.
It was awful, and the more information that comes out, the more awful it becomes. You represent two of the brave officers who helped defend the Capitol that day. News broke last week that there was more evidence that other of their colleagues may have been involved in the insurrection attempt themselves. What is that like for you? I know you can't really talk about what that's like for your clients. What's that like for you, knowing that?
Well, we don't have all the underlying facts because they didn't publish them. Capitol Police did not make public the details. But even assuming that a small handful of these officers may have, behaved inappropriately that day by cooperating with the insurrectionists in some manner, is highly troubling. Particularly when you think of it in the broader context of what we've learned about the penetration of right-wing extremists into U.S. military forces, state and local law enforcement. But the good news is this was only a very small number of officers. The conduct on its face, as far as we know, may not have been egregious. And by and large, the officers who defended the Capitol did so with incredible heroism and valor that day. The fight that took place at the entrance to the Lower West Terrace of the Capitol, in my mind, stands side by side with the greatest battles U.S. military forces have ever fought in World War I and World War II. These officers were prepared to fight to the death to prevent the insurrectionists from breaching that port of entry into the Capitol, and they did so. They didn't know that the Capitol had been breached elsewhere. They thought that they were the only mechanism for preventing the breach of the Capitol. And as you could see from the videos, as you heard from Sergeant Gunnell's testimony, it was hand-to-hand combat comparable to a medieval battle. Desperate, inch by inch fighting. Horrible injuries, physical and psychic, to the officers in that space. You heard Gunnell testify. You heard Metropolitan Police Officer Hodges testify. Just terrible wounds suffered by these officers that will have lasting effects. And for anybody to deny what happened that day is just astonishing. It is the most documented event, maybe not just in American history, but in world history. The number of videos and audio recordings, from start to finish of that day are incredible in their volume and their documentation of what happened that day. It's all there for us to see. And it stands as a testament, not just to the complete void of patriotism of those who took up violence against the Capitol, but to the heroism of the officers who protected democracy that day.
What is your feeling about the way these people who have been arrested have been treated? At this point in time, about 600 people have been charged, 78 remain jailed pending trial, and 2/3 of those still face jail time for assaulting officers. This rally this weekend was supposed to be in support of them, and we've already addressed the fact that it did not have a huge turnout. What is your feeling about the people who are trying to say that these people are being treated unfairly after what they have done to our sense of safety, even in our country?
Well, from everything I can see about the public-facing criminal prosecutions of these individuals, the criticism of those who have been charged that they're somehow political prisoners is just preposterous nonsense without a shred of merit. The criminal justice system seems to be working just fine because it's working the way it ordinarily works. I don't think these individuals are being treated any better or worse than anyone else who comes within the criminal justice system. Some judges have refused government requests to detain some of these defendants. There has been some pushback against some of the charges sought by the Department of Justice in some of these cases. So there is every reason to think that they are being treated completely fairly under applicable law and criminal procedure.
What are the next stages of the investigation?
Of January 6th?
Yes.
Well, hard to say because we don't have much visibility into it. It could be that there remain ongoing criminal investigations, for example, to determine who funded elements of the gathering that day, who made possible travel to the Capitol that day and for what purpose. What other conspiracies are susceptible to being charged and for what crimes. The ultimate question of whether anyone associated with fomenting or inciting the crowd to march on the Capitol through their public speaking that day, including the former president, may have committed any crimes. Those are probably the toughest questions to consider. Hard to tell whether those questions remain under consideration. I hope that at least there is a fulsome investigation by the department to flesh out those tough questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have an audience question. What should we do about the people who look at the insurrection and say it was justified or don't believe that it happened? So is there anything to be done with people like that? I mean, and what should we as a nation do with people like that? I mean, my view is that, a lot of this is caused by the propaganda of Fox News. And I don't know what there is to be done about, taking down these propagandists. But that it is a real problem. What do you think? What are your take on that? What's your take?
I mean, it's a big problem, particularly, with speech being protected by the First Amendment. We don't want to engage in line drawing because the speech that is constitutionally protected is not speech that we agree with. So the challenge is to assess when constitutionally protected speech may be migrating into potential agreements or threats to commit violence. I suppose the most we can do is to try to determine who is influencing those mindsets and what, if anything, can be done about that. If Facebook or Twitter or other social media sites are platforms for fomenting those kinds of dangerous conspiracy theories, should they be taking a tougher view of what their terms of service are to consider whether they could take a more aggressive posture toward subscribers who engage in that speech? Are there other so-called influencers who could be reached to disavow their support for what happened on January 6th? We probably need to manage our expectations about whether Fox News is going to change its tone. It is an accelerant times 10 for these kinds of views. But I don't hold that much hope that Rupert Murdoch and his minions are going to wake up one day and do the right thing by the United States of America.
Of course not. They have shown where their alliances. They want power. They're all for authoritarianism and fascism, and you see it. You see it in their programming. It's absolutely terrifying. Living in the Panhandle of Florida, it seems like that's all anyone and everyone watches. They listen to the radio shows, they watch that, and they are just getting brainwashed all day long, and it's so upsetting. I wanted to ask you one more question. I was watching one of your interviews on CNN this past weekend when I was preparing for this interview, and they were asking about election crime, and I know that your experience is in national security and really looking into that and crimes that are affecting our national security. What happens when election crime becomes a national security issue? How does that, we're in unprecedented times. We haven't seen this kind of thing before our country before. What happens when they become one and the same?
Well, there's an architecture in place that's longstanding in the Department of Justice that affords a mechanism for the expertise within the department on election crimes to work hand in hand with prosecutors and agents with national security responsibilities. That's what happened in the run-up to the 2016 election when I was serving as chief of the Counterintelligence and Export Control Section in the National Security Division, and we were monitoring potential threats to the election that were cyber in nature to begin with. That later turned into an investigation of Russian interference in the election itself, which we were overseeing until Bob Mueller was appointed as a special counsel. So, what you're describing is a kind of circumstance where different equities, so to speak, within the department are brought to bear to work together in a collaborative fashion to bring their expertise to the table and look at what laws have been violated or could be violated, what our options are using the tool set of law enforcement tools to either disrupt a threat or to hold accountable people who are deemed to have violated the law.
Absolutely. Absolutely. David, thank you so much for coming on today and talking about this. This is all very heavy stuff for our Lunch with Lincoln show, but it's very important stuff. Before we started, we learned that David is actually from Houston, Texas, and David and I bonded over coming from states that are just not doing right by their people. And I was telling David about how this weekend the Lincoln Project had a really good time with an ad that we put up. We were supposed to be running it during the Texas Rice game. Most of you saw that Abbott got really upset about that on Friday, and there were lots of headlines about him and his consultants calling the Lincoln Project all sorts of names. It's great to live inside his head. David is disappointed in his governor, as I am in mine in Florida. It turns out that our ad did not air during the football game, that the University of Texas pulled it right before then. We are still looking into that, but we thought we'd go ahead and give you guys a look at the ad that Abbott does not want you to see. So Emily, if you'll let that run, I would appreciate it. Well, there's our ad, and you can find it on YouTube. You can find it on social media. Please share it and let's give Abbott a really big headache. David, again, thank you so much for being on. I'm sorry you're from Texas, like I'm sorry I'm from Florida. What are you going to do about it? Thank you so much for the work that you are doing right now. I think it's very important work, and keep up the good work. Thank you, everybody. We will see you on Friday.